Algebra 2 skills number 5, powers of I. So what we're going to do is look at a cycle of powers of I. So we know anything to 0 power except 0 itself is 1. That's one of the exponent rules that you have learned by this point. I to the first power is, we know the square root of -1, but for this particular lesson we're just going to call it I. So anything to the first power is itself. So you're not going to see that in this lesson. I squared is -1. If you've been working with imaginary numbers at all, that's one of the fundamental things to know, is that I squared is equal to -1. I cubed is -I, and the reason for that is I squared times I to the first is I to the third. Just knowing your exponent rules. 2 plus 1 is 3. Well, I squared is -1. I to the first is just I. -1 times I is -I. Now, if you take I to the 4th power, it would be 1 again. I to the 5th power would be I, and so forth. So this is the cycle that will continue regardless of what power you raise I to, if it's a whole number power. So we're going to look at two different methods for finding the value of I raised to a higher power. Okay, so one way would just be to memorize the previous pattern, that if you have a remainder of 0 when you divide by 4, you get the same thing as I to 0 power, just 1. If you get a remainder of 1, it's the same thing as I to the first power, just I. Remainder of 2, be I squared or -I, and the remainder of 3 is -1, excuse me, for remainder of 2. Remainder of 3 would be -I. Another way that some people like to do it, it's probably less common, is to see how many I squareds go into the power. So we're going to look at a couple examples here. So I've got a split screen here. We're going to figure out I to the 55th power in two different ways. Okay, so one way is the first way. We're just going to divide by 4. 55 divided by 4 is 13 with a remainder of 3. Come to find out, this 13 here is not relevant. We're all about focusing on this 3 here. If you remember, I to the 3rd power is -I, so therefore I to the 55th power is also -I. It's the same thing as I raised to that remainder if you divide by 4. So that's one method. Another method that some people like, but not very common, but we'll look at it, is to split it apart. Say I to the 5th is the same thing as I to the 55th, the same thing as I to the 54th times I to the 1st, because 54 plus 1 is 55. And then I squared goes into, well, 2 goes into 54 27 times, and we know I squared is the same thing as -1, and -1 raised to an odd power is -1. It ends up being -I that way. And this may seem kind of around the world a little bit, but there's a technique to it. If you have an odd power, you pull that extra I out and then see how many times does 2 go into whatever you have left. If that divides out odd here, it's going to be negative. If it divided out even, it would be positive. So again, it's not a skill that a lot of people use. Most people do this, but it is worth looking at. So as a second example, I to the 68th power, again, divide by 4. The 17 is not relevant. I to the 0 power, if you remember anything, the 0 power is 1. Okay, so same as before. Or the other method, this time it's even, so we're not going to take out an extra I. We're just going to say it's I squared to the 34th. I squared is -1, and this time -1 is raised to an even power, therefore it's just 1. And so two different ways to find I to a higher power.